Good evening.
Good evening.
I'm Joyce King. I'm president of AERA. Can I have a little applause? Very nice. Very nice. That's the Queen's wave. Okay, we're so happy that we have commandeered the congressman, and he's going to be speaking with us, and Professor Linda Darling Hammond, past president of AERA, will make comments after, and if there's time, there is a microphone here if you choose to participate with questions or comments. This session is being live streamed, so you should say your name and affiliation if you come to the microphone. So I'm going to just give a little brief highlights of the congressman's background, but you can see the full bio on his website. I'd like to cut it a little bit short just so that there's more time for this important discussion. Congressman Robert C. Bobby Scott is currently serving his 12th term in Congress. Prior to serving in the House of Representatives, he served in the Virginia House of Delegates from 1978 to 1983, and in the Senate of Virginia from 1983 to 1993. During his tenure in the Virginia General Assembly, Congressman Scott successfully sponsored laws critical to Virginians in education, employment, health care, social services, economic development, crime prevention, and consumer protection. His legislative successes included laws that increased Virginia's minimum wage, created the Governor's Employment and Training Council, and improved health care benefits for women, infants, and children. He also sponsored the Neighborhood Assistance Act, which provides tax credits to businesses for donations made to approved social service and crime prevention programs. Congressman Scott has the distinction of being the first African American elected to Congress from the Commonwealth of Virginia since Reconstruction, and only the second African American elected to Congress in Virginia's history. Having a maternal grandfather of Filipino ancestry also gives him the distinction of being the first African American with Filipino ancestry to serve as a voting member of Congress. Congressman Scott currently serves as the ranking member of the Committee on Education and the Workforce, a committee that he has served on since his arrival in Congress in 1993. In his capacity as the most senior Democrat on the committee, he is leading the fight for access to quality early, secondary, and higher education for all America's children, with an emphasis on solving the growing problem of student debt, closing the achievement gap, and dismantling the school-to-prison pipeline. Additionally, he is focused on ensuring that millions of Americans have the opportunity to go to work every day and know that they will be treated fairly, paid a decent and living wage, given a safe environment in which to do their jobs, and provided access to affordable health care. And the last comment I'll share from the bio: in 2010, The Hill, a Capitol newspaper, recognized Congressman Scott as one of the 25 hardest working members of Congress. The Hill later recognized him in 2012 as one of the Capitol Hill's 50 most beautiful people. So I guess you're right up there with James Brown, Congressman Scott. Congressman Scott, please. Give him a round of applause.
I thought this was a research group. I get
we have fun.
hardest working, no reaction. Most beautiful, yay! Thank you, Joyce. It's a pleasure to be here and with Linda and others. And I want to thank the American Educational Research Association for inviting me to speak. The work of researchers is often overlooked. It reminds me of a story of a famous organist who was going around the country playing the organ recitals. He ended up at an old church, a historic church, and he was given a nice introduction. And I said historic church. I mean, that's church was so old that the organ wasn't hooked up to the electricity. He needed to pump the air to make the thing work. So he stood up and announced, "I will now play Mozart," and sat down, hit the keys, nothing. He looked over where the man was supposed to be pumping the air. He saw the man there. "I will now play Mozart." Hit the keys, nothing, not a sound. He stared at the man. The man looked back. "I will now play Mozart." Hit the keys, nothing. He looked at walked over and said, "Sir, when are you going to start pumping the air?" And the man said, "I'll start pumping the air when you tell the audience that we will now play Mozart." When it comes to policy, politicians may get all the credit, get all the press, but unless we're working with some researchers, we won't know what we're talking about. So it's good to be with you, and look forward to the discussion. I've been a legislator, as Joyce mentioned, at the state and federal level for many years, and over that time, I've learned that when you're seeking to create new policy, legislators are often faced with a distinct choice. We can play politics, or we can do what works, but you can't do both. As a matter of fact, I've done a lot in crime policy. I served on the Judiciary Committee for many years, and good political crime policy is getting a good vote-getting soundbite. 3 strikes and you're out, mandatory minimum sentences. Get it to rhyme, it's even better. If you do the adult crime, you do the adult time. No good politician ever votes against a crime bill named after somebody. No matter what the policy, whether it makes sense or not, you don't want to vote against a crime bill named after somebody. All those slogans and sound bites have gotten us. It's to the point where we now lock up a higher portion of our population than any country on earth, by far, so much so there's recent research to show that we're locking up so many people, we're actually adding to crime, not reducing crime. And it's, the Children's Defense Fund calls the present situation the cradle-to-prison pipeline. So many young people born on a trajectory to go right to prison. And we know that, on the other hand, good, cost-effective crime policy, effective crime policy, is kind of hard to get people interested in. And so you have that choice. And let me tell you, if it wasn't for research, it would be all slogans and sound bites. So we wouldn't have any chance of doing anything intelligent. But the getting that research in a timely manner is always a challenge. I often attend university commencements, and I noticed that right beside the name of PhD candidates, the subject of their thesis or dissertation. And sometimes I noticed that, we had just considered legislation in that subject area, and it would have been nice to have found out what those findings were. But we never got that information, so we don't know whether we did the right thing or not. So clearly, powerful research is happening, but it's not always finding it to the policymakers or the practitioners who could benefit and use it as we try to make real changes for the lives of Americans. As a ranking member of the House Committee on Education and the Workforce, I know that our deliberations, if you can call them deliberations, would greatly benefit if we had more research available. And as everybody here knows, we're in the process of reauthorizing the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, ESEA. The original ESEA really established the federal role of public education, elementary and secondary education, and it was designed to try to make real the promise in Brown v. Board of Education, which in 1954 the Supreme Court said, "In these days it is doubtful that any child may reasonably be expected to succeed in life if denied the opportunity of an education. Such an opportunity, where the state has undertaken to provide it, is a right which must be made available to all on equal terms." The fact is, however, that equal educational opportunities have never been available in low-income communities. First, because we generally fund education through the real estate tax, so wealthier areas always will have more resources than low-income areas, and just in the normal give and take in politics, we know that the low-income area is always going to get the shorter end of the stick. And so all of the studies have concluded, in spite of that, that areas of concentrated poverty actually need more, not less, resources to provide adequate educational opportunities. And so, with the enactment of, in 1965, of the first Elementary and Secondary Education Act, Congress provided federal money to address, and I quote from the original bill, the special educational needs of children of low-income families and the impact that concentrations of low-income families have on the ability of local educational agencies to support adequate educational programs. Now, over the last 50 years, educational research has been instrumental in showing us where improvements need to be made, and we've made some improvements. In 50 years, we have improved the achievement gap between minorities and other students, but there has been a growing concern about the, although we've been reducing the racial gap, there's a growing gap between rich and poor students, and that's growing. And if we don't come to grips with that, it threatens to leave a permanent underclass of students behind. Also, in the area of school discipline, recent research confirms significant disparities in our school system regarding how different groups of children are disciplined. In February, the UCLA Civil Rights Project, in coordination with the NAACP Legal Defense Fund and the National Disability Rights Network, released a report that showed significant racial disparities in school suspensions. The biggest disparity wasn't in the Deep South, but it was actually in Wisconsin, where 4% of the whites were being suspended, but 30% of African Americans. Many large districts, large urban districts, are suspending more than 1 out of every 5 elementary school students at least once. Now, exactly what do elementary school students do that provokes somebody to deny them their educational opportunity through a suspension? High school students with disabilities are suspended, as we well know, at alarming rates. And we know that there's a correlation, significant correlation between suspensions and eventually dropping out of school. High school dropout was on a trajectory that's full of unemployment, low wages, and prisons. And it's hard enough to get a job with just a high school diploma, because most jobs require education past the high school level. So if you're a dropout, you're in bad shape. Now, that education past the high school level doesn't have to be a 4-year college. It could be community college, apprenticeships, but some education and training past the high school level. And vocational education offers a lot of promise. One recent governor in Virginia all of a sudden became a strong supporter of vocational education. And I found out exactly what happened. He was just moved into the governor's mansion and discovered a plumbing problem. Now, he knows government enough to know that the way to get it fixed is to call general services, wait, get 3 low bids. He skipped all that, just looked in the phone book, called a plumber. The plumber got there, looked, was there 20 minutes, fixed the situation, and handed the governor a bill, $150. The governor looked at it, $150, good God almighty, you're here 20 minutes, $150? That's $450 an hour. When I was practicing law, I never charged anybody $450 an hour. The plumber said, well, Governor, I know what you mean, because when I was a lawyer, I never charged anybody $450 an hour either. Some of those vocational education jobs pay right well. Let me turn this off before I embarrass myself. And so we need to make sure that those jobs are available. And while it's important that we continue our investments in research, we have to get the next generation out of the cradle-to-prison pipeline and into a cradle-to-career pipeline, and it's research that's got to be able to show us how to do that, and that research has to be disseminated where policymakers and researchers can work together to ensure that your insights are not limited to pages on academic journals, but also find their ways into schools, districts, state education agencies, and to policymakers to improve the innovation, drive instruction, and to close the achievement gaps. Now, there's a lot of area where research is still needed. We need to improve educator effectiveness, how to make sure that teachers and principals are prepared and be most successful for all different kinds of students, and what kind of ongoing professional development can actually work, and then how to measure effectiveness. That's one thing that we've been grappling with. Some have said, we'll just give them a test and see how the children do. Well, that may not be fair, because if you have a good teacher in a bad school, their job may be at risk if they're going to get fired for the scores of the students. You got a bad student at a good school, they're going to be home free. It's even worse if you're in a bad school and you're trying to collaborate with the other teachers and you notice the teacher's having trouble with a student. Well, send Johnny over to me. Let me work with him. Well, my average just went down. I might lose my job trying to help you with a bad student. We don't really have good assessments that are fair to determine which teachers are high quality and which are not. I can tell you, though, that I think if we want better quality teachers, this conversation has got to start with salaries. You want better quality teachers, you pay better quality salaries, and the problem may take care of itself. We have mandated that teachers be certified in the subject that they're teaching, federal mandate, which is, in my judgment, a little detached from reality. It suggests that the school boards were looking at all these qualified people that applied, going over them, finding unqualified people, when I believe the reality is you couldn't find enough qualified teachers to apply. You hired all the qualified ones, you still needed to hire some more, and with the salaries you were offering, you didn't have anybody that applied, and that's why you had some uncertified teachers, not because you needed a federal mandate to know what to do, but again, if we're not going to talk about salaries, I think we're going to always have a problem with qualities. We need instruction on how to turn around a struggling school, and we know some strategies work and some don't, and we need to make sure that we can eliminate or at least reduce the achievement gap. One of the exciting things happening in my hometown in Newport News is the school board has decided to have a really intensive summer program in the low-income area, about a program big enough to involve about 1/3 of all of the children in that area will have access to a academic morning and an enrichment program in the afternoon, and for about 8 weeks during the summer. I think people here know that what some call the summer slide is responsible for almost all of the achievement gap. And if we can get people not only to stop regressing, but actually go forward, we believe not only will we eliminate the achievement gap with these students, we'll also sabotage their need to join a gang, because they're involved in so many other activities and don't need to join a gang. But we're going to need research to show this works, because if it works, that will be part of every bill that passes after that. Make sure you have an intensive summer program, but only if we get good research. And so, as I indicated, we're in the middle of reauthorizing ESEA, and the challenge is to make sure that we get your research into the final product. That's going to be kind of hard, because in the House we started the process this year without a single hearing. Just went straight to markup. If you look at the fact that we didn't have any hearings, there are a lot of things in the Democratic substitute that we did have a hearing, and based on the hearing and other research, we had a bill that includes many of the elements that are absent from H.R. 5, includes early childhood education, higher standards, more meaningful assessments and requirements that you actually address inequities when you see them. One major flaw in No Child Left Behind was the fact that after the testing, and you found out that there were deficiencies, No Child Left Behind really didn't help you solve the deficiencies. They punished you, but didn't help you. And so, unfortunately, most of the conversation is around assessments, where we need better assessments. We need more precise assessments. I get frustrated on that because farmers told me that you don't fatten a pig by weighing the pig. After you've done the assessments and determined that you got failing schools and achievement gaps and subgroups not performing, that tends to be the end of the conversation. That ought to be the beginning of the conversation, and we ought to be talking about what we can do to improve. But we'll need your research to inform us and what needs to be actually done to eliminate the achievement gaps and make sure that all children are performing. But the sponsors of H.R. 5, by contrast, ignored basic research. In fact, they started the bill in Title I by trying to change the funding formula. Under their new funding formula, they eliminate the plus-ups for concentrated poverty and have a straight per capita. They call it portability, but basically, under the present formula, if you have 15% poverty, you get a little bonus, and 30% poverty, you get a little more bonus. Concentrated poverty gets a little more. When you go straight across the board, it has the effect of reducing funding in low-income areas and increasing funding in high-income areas. Baltimore City, for example, with a high concentration of low-income students, would lose about 11% of its Title I funding. Howard County, with lower poverty levels, would pick up about a 25% increase. Los Angeles, 70% poverty, would lose about a quarter of its funding under Title I. Beverly Hills, with virtually no poverty, will pick up 25%. Now, they call it portability. We call it reverse Robin Hood, stealing from the poor to give to the rich. I think we know that schools of high concentration of poverty actually need more, and that's what the fundamental basis of ESEA was, to deal with low-income students and high concentrations of poverty. I think our colleagues in the Senate have seen in their markup, I think the funding formula, the original funding formula, has been restored, but there's still some problems with that bill. I think it's a little weak on what needs to be done after the assessment. And we have to make sure that there is some insistence that if you notice that there are deficiencies, you need to do something about it. I look forward to the ESEA debate. It's our goal to make sure the focus of deliberations is not on slogans and sound bites, but on research and what actually works. And that means that we can have high standards that all students would be held to, accountability, and intervention measures that are evidence-based and effective, and collect the data to show what we're doing right and what we're doing wrong. And that process is ongoing. It's kind of fallen off track in the House. But if the Senate takes action, I think we'll get it back on course, and hopefully we can have a bill that everybody agrees on. And when I'm talking about data, I think we need to mention at least the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, FERPA, that the use of student data together with digital and online learning are tools that can be integral parts of education today. Through effective data use, principals and district leaders can make more informed decisions, and teachers more quickly recognize where students need help. Researchers need to rely on data to diagnose achievement gaps and determine effective new policies. But when FERPA passed more than 40 years ago, there was no such thing as digital records. There was no such thing as cloud storage or third-party vendors and that kind of thing. So we need to update it to make sure that the privacy is protected and we can still get good use of the data. Any update of FERPA must carefully balance those concerns so that we get the privacy protections but not stifle innovation in research. Now, we've released a discussion draft on an update of FERPA, and we're in the process of soliciting feedback from parent groups, educators, technology companies, and others, and I would hope that the researchers would also weigh in to make sure we're going in the right direction. And hopefully we'll have in a couple of weeks a bill that everybody can agree on and go forward and update FERPA in the 21st century. Now, research is a cornerstone of any effort to improve, but research is not effective if it stays locked up in a computer file or only published in a trade journal. Research must be relevant and timely, and it must be used to solve real problems faced by students and teachers in classrooms across the country. As policymakers, we rely on your work to guide our work, and good policy promotes best practices and encourages promising and innovative new strategies. In Congress, I intend to continue to work to promote research, particularly in education, and hope that we can work together, like the organist and the guy pumping the air, to do a better job of ensuring the research ends up in the hands of those who can use it to improve outcomes for students. The success of the educational legislation and the future of our next generation depends on us getting it right. So thank you very much for all that you do.
Well, we are very grateful to you, Congressman Scott, for both being with us today and for your tireless efforts to improve education and opportunities for youth. Yesterday and this morning, I know that the Congressman was in Indianapolis with the National Council on Educating Black Children, speaking at that very important convention. I was there the day before, and others have come with him. Today he's here in Chicago to help us think about ESEA, and that's the kind of pace of work that he maintains. We're very lucky that he is one of the 25 hardest working congressmen. I didn't know that fact, but I knew it in reality, because he carries a very, very major challenge and responsibility in the days and weeks to come as the Senate has begun to move forward with its vote out of committee of the new reauthorization possibility for ESEA. It has to go to the floor in the House, as Bobby suggested. The Republican bill was kind of just pushed on through, and there's a Democratic bill that has many of the features that he spoke to, and some kind of reconciliation that is going to be a real hard-fought battle is going to need to occur. I thought I would respond, first of all, by simply pointing out some of the research that supports the points that the Congressman has already made. It's wonderful to have a wise person in that role, and then to, I hope, pledge on all our behalves to be responsive as this process moves forward, because certainly we do need a new ESEA, and it's going to be quite a challenge to get the kind of law that we really want. And that we really need. Among the underappreciated facts in the process of the country over the last decade is the fact that the entire education enterprise has become more inequitable as the country has become more inequitable. So as we've had this growing divide between rich and poor, a growing income gap, which, as the Congressman mentioned, actually is showing that poverty is a greater predictor now of lack of opportunity than it was in the past. We've also had a growing funding gap between the districts that serve rich and poor children. More than twice as many children are homeless now as was true a decade ago. If you filled all the NFL stadiums on a Sunday with people, that would be the amount of children who are living without steady home and shelter. We've had a growing rate of poverty. Now, more than half of children in the United States in public schools are eligible for free and reduced price lunch. So ESEA, which used to be thought of as for a small minority of children, is now actually for most children in public education. But of course, they live in dramatically different contexts, affluent and poor children in this country. The Education Trust put out a report this week that demonstrated that the gap in funding for kids who live in districts that are high in poverty has grown, particularly if they're also districts with a large number of African American and Latino students. The gap is about $2,000 per pupil between affluent districts, or districts serving affluent children, and those serving poor and minority children. One of the big battles that occurs in Washington and elsewhere is the battle about whether money makes a difference. And you will get those who will say, well, there's no evidence that money makes a difference. Typically, they will point to the large per pupil spending in Washington, D.C., which, frankly, I think is because that's what happened when Congress runs a school system. Present company totally accepted from that point. But in general, that is not the case for children of color and low-income children in terms of their resources. And there was an amazing study that was done this last summer by Karabo Jackson, Rucker Johnson, Claudia Persico, which actually took on that issue and looked over the last 40 years in 28 states at what happened when school funding reforms that equalized funding were in place for the 12 years of a child's education. And they found that low-income children who had 20% more spent on them over the 12 years of their educational career, graduated from high school at rates 23 percentage points higher than they otherwise would have. That's an extraordinarily large effect. They went on and got about an additional year of education. They earned salaries personally about 25% higher than they would have, and their family income was about 52% higher. They completely closed the poverty gap as adults between poor and non-poor young people when they had started that process. Not only does that kind of investment, which is a relatively small investment, that 20%, which is what we're trying to do with programs like Title I, not only does that make a difference for those people individually, but it helps our entire society because those young people who got good jobs that made more money and paid more taxes, which pays for my Social Security and your retirement and your health care benefits, allow the social contract to work. And instead of being in prison, as the congressman noted, where we would have in California spent $50,000 on young people who we would not spend $10,000 on to educate a few years earlier, they, by virtue of being a part of the society, help everyone and the entire society thrive to a greater level. And I think some of those kinds of arguments are also needed in the political environment in D.C. A second area where you pointed out the issues that we face is in inequities in school discipline. There's now a lot of research about how social emotional learning programs and restorative justice activities can dramatically reduce those suspensions and expulsions. A possible high point in the Senate bill that will hopefully eventually emerge and come to the House is that there's now an expectation that states could evaluate schools on multiple measures, not just test scores. And those measures can include such things as opportunities to learn, could include such things as equity and resources, could include such things as graduation rates, and also suspension and expulsion rates. And we've found in California, where that kind of dashboard has already been put in place, that the suspension and expulsion rates, those exclusion rates with the discriminatory gaps, are beginning to reduce because schools are being held accountable for whether they keep kids in school, whether they get them to graduate, as well as what's happening with achievement. You mentioned evidence-based approaches to school turnaround. It's an area where, as the bill moves forward, I think I would pledge, and Joyce and others in this room, to be available at a much faster pace than academic research is normally made available to your office and others to document some of those evidence-based approaches to school turnaround, which include strategic investments in professional learning, the right kinds of investments in wraparound services to meet the needs that students bring so they can be ready to learn every day. There's been a huge decrease in ESEA funding for those wraparound services for community schools from what there used to be back in the early days of ESEA. And we can look to the fact that in the early days of ESEA, when the War on Poverty and the Great Society were being put in place, that's in fact when we had the greatest closing of the achievement gap, the greatest gains for African American students, the greatest gains for Hispanic students, far greater than what we've had in the last decade. If we had stayed on track with investing, as you put it, in, not just testing, we would have closed the achievement gap between black and white students by the year 2000 in reading, had we maintained those programs that were eliminated in the 1980s and some of them in the 1990s, including, as you put it, the summer programs, which were ubiquitous at that time, and the programs that really did allow deep, deep investments in the services, the community services that children need. So I think that the outline of what you've put forward is well defended and well articulated by the research that's available. The point you made about getting to a better way of evaluating schools and teachers is very much needed. As you probably are aware, a lot of the research community has been concerned about the test-based teacher evaluation strategies that have been experimented with across the country. The American Statistical Association recently observed that ranking teachers by their VAM scores can have unintended consequences that reduce quality. The scores have very large error rates. They're very unstable for all the reasons that you outlined. And we do know that evaluation based on standards-based strategies improves teachers' effectiveness and improves their capacity. So there are ways that we can contribute, I think, to a way that accountability is well-grounded and enables teachers, schools, and children to move forward. So I thank you for being so well-informed. That's a wonderful thing for a congressperson. To have already identified all of the areas where we need to move. And I think to your point about the importance of having the evidence at hand, there will be a lot of need for that in the coming weeks and the coming months. And I think I speak for this association in saying we will be at the ready to be efficaciously available to you in that effort. And we thank you so much for being the hardest working congressperson and the best looking. I think we are able to take comments at the microphone and questions. People are moving there. Please come to the mic because it's being recorded and we want to be sure to get your wise words.
Hi.
Arthur.
I'm Arthur Kamens. I'm at Stevens Institute of Technology in New Jersey. Two other areas that around evidence and policy that haven't been mentioned so far today. One has to do with the frequency of tests and whether to use it for program purposes only a few times rather than every year. It's what most other countries do. The other has to do with charter schools, which seem to be, which are on average no better than regular public schools and seem to be exacerbating socioeconomic and racial isolation. So those are two areas where I think the evidence is pretty strong and it seems to be ignored.
Comment?
On the charter schools, one of the frustrations I have is we spend 10% of the students are in charter schools. We spend 90% of our time arguing about what to do about charter schools. And as you've indicated, on average, they're average. So it's all, except for the fact that on average, they are racially diverse, on average. I mean, but of course, if you have 1 foot in boiling water, 1 foot in an ice bucket, on average, you're comfortable. As you have suggested, that on average, the same proportion of minorities are in charter schools, but they tend to all be in the same one, and others isolated white. Tests, like I said, everybody's talking about measurements. The problem with some of these tests, if you test at the end of the year, it's useless. What are you going to do? Oh, the student failed. I mean, it'd be nice to have known that in October, when you could have adjusted your instruction so that by June, maybe they wouldn't be failing. Waiting until June to give one test for the purpose of instruction is useless. Maybe for the purpose of grading the school system, it may be helpful, but not helping the student. And so all of these tests and assessments have to be valid for the purpose for which they're being used. And there is one of the amendments that Democrats are offering is an idea that we'll have funding to help states reduce the number of tests to the bare minimum needed to accomplish the goals that the tests are trying to accomplish. So valid for the purpose for which they're being used, but you can't, I mean, you need some research to find out exactly what tests, how often a test has to be given to be able to get the information you're looking for.
Hi. I'm a recently retired classroom teacher and graduate student. And I am so glad to hear discussion about questioning the validity of the scores, all of the errors, which I had a lot less understanding of before I started my graduate program, but I think it was almost common sense amongst teachers and a lot of people that these things were so flawed. But at the same time, you know, teachers' careers hinged on that. I know teachers who lost jobs, teachers who lost lives. I mean, this is a very critical issue, and it's just good to hear somebody questioning that. But also, I would like for you to elaborate a little bit on what happened in the 80s when the funding for Title I was withdrawn. Those were such good statistics on what difference could have made if the monies had continued.
Mm-hmm.
Well, there were many things that were happening in the 60s and 70s, and those of us who are old enough to remember, you know, there was not only the resource in ESEA, which was directed to programs for reading and mathematics and so on, but also for desegregation assistance. There was a lot of leverage on school funding equity that was also coming from federal programs beyond the ESEA. There were major programs because at that time, Health and Education and Welfare, HEW, housed the education, what is now the department. So there were a lot of programs around summer programs. Every youth could get access to summer school enrichment, summer jobs, et cetera, which is one of the biggest components of the achievement gap, as the congressman noted. So all of those investments that were focused on, there were great investments in teachers, urban teacher corps, ending the teacher shortages. Teachers' salaries were higher then, even in the cities. In fact, often they were better paid in the cities than in the suburbs. There's a lot going on. In 1981, when Ronald Reagan came in, those programs were one by one closed, many of them closed down. And while ESEA continued as a program, many of those elements that I just described were ended. And by the end of the 80s, most of the supports for community schools and wraparound services and summer programs and desegregation assistance and so on had been eliminated. And so ESEA took a different tack in later years as it became, particularly in the last 10 or 12 years, as it became focused more on the testing and sanctions rather than the investing to enable good youth and child development.
Yes, please.
Mike Mastriani, University at Albany. Congressman, thank you so much for coming. Just one quick question. How would you recommend we disseminate our research in a way that does have more impact, in a way that does reach policymakers other than education research journals? Thank you.
Tell us the answer, please.
I'm not sure. But I think following legislation, contacting legislators, developing a relationship with legislators. I've run into Linda probably 5 or 6 times in the last 5 or 6 months. You know, if I need...
I'm not stalking you.
I need... Oh, it's always different place, different cities. But I mean, it's forming a relationship with legislators. I know Diana Daniels, we mentioned National Council for Educating Black Children. She's been active in that for many years. When we're dealing with research, that's one of the first calls I'd make. But you have to establish a relationship, because if I get a letter saying on this bill, these are my thoughts. If I don't know who it is, you just kind of file it. Okay, I heard it, but I don't know what to do with it. But if I know that you've been in touch with me from time to time, I know that you're well respected in the research community, and what you say is based on good research, I'll receive it with a different attitude. If we're going off in one direction and Linda says that based on her research you're going in the wrong direction, I mean, there are enough people around that we might actually stop going in that direction. You get some anonymous person, you don't have that influence. So you can't do it overnight. You have to just develop the relationship and make sure that the organizations are on top of the legislation. After the bill is passed, I think Harry Truman used some salty language to say something to the effect of, before a bill passes, he's willing to listen to everybody, but after he signed the bill, that's when the salty language comes in.
My name's Kitty Kelly Epstein. I'm from Oakland, California, and I teach teachers and graduate students. And I wanted to thank you it's very reassuring to see someone in person in Congress who has a sensible and caring approach to these issues, and a lighthearted one too, because certainly sometimes we want to laugh and other times we want to cry. But anyway, I just wanted to raise the issue of the need for teacher diversity. That we need a teaching workforce that looks like the kids and the families for a whole lot of reasons. Some have been mentioned over and over again, but jobs are important for the communities that are not getting the teaching jobs. And we've had recruitment events where we've had hundreds of people fill up City Hall who are African American, Latino, and Asian who want to teach and have college degrees. There are a number of barriers. Some of them are financial, some of them are tests. People can get through those barriers, and there are some very successful programs. I think it needs to be a bigger priority on the national agenda, because those really good programs are fairly small, and so to make the kind of difference that is really needed. So, so the kid's mom can run into the teacher in the grocery store, which has a big impact on how you do in school. So I hope we can raise that to a higher level. Thank you very much for your work.
Thank you.
Can I say something?
Yeah, come on, Linda.
Because I'm very passionate about this, so I appreciate it. In the Health Professions Education Assistance Act, we put money into training doctors for the positions and the fields where we have shortages. And we used to do that in teaching as well. We used to have a lot of federal money that would support people coming into the teaching profession in Finland and Singapore and the high-achieving countries all around the world. If you want to teach, you will go completely at government expense to a high-quality program and get a salary or a stipend while you're training, so everyone gets this very good training without going into debt, as we do here, to go into a profession that, as the Congressman said, pays 60% of what other college graduates are earning. I believe that if we could put those programs back in place, those were some of the programs that existed in the 60s and 70s when we eliminated the teacher shortage and brought more people into the profession, as North Carolina did with their teaching fellows, which disproportionately brought in people of color and male teachers and math and science teachers, who then were more effective than other teachers and stayed for a career in teaching. We could solve a lot of the problems that we have in our schools. So I'm just going to leave that out there as a pitch, that when the moment is right, we need to be able to say, if you will teach, we will pay for your education. And I think we will very rapidly diversify and raise the standards in the teaching profession.
One of the things I'd like to add to that has to do with the content of instruction and the content of teacher learning. So we had great progress in the 60s and 70s with African American studies, ethnic studies, Mexican American studies, yet there has never been a formal link or expectation that that content should inform teacher preparation. And we're now getting some data, evidence that shows that children who have a strong racial identity, group pride, their achievement actually increases. So that's an area of potential improvement to think about. Yes?
Hi, thank you. My name is Caleb Dawson. I am an undergraduate student at Gonzaga University in Spokane, Washington. And my question is regarding funding. When I think about the budget at my high school that I grew up at, I think about how my high school used to have the auto mechanic program, and then the other school used to have this program and that program, but now funding maybe go to trade sort of things where we send students off to some public service opportunity for them to develop some trade skills. And so I'm wondering what sort of relationship and dynamic those opportunities are supposed to play, when my concern is that funding those programs primarily instead of like computer science and some other things where it's like, oh, here's something immediate that you can do, may subjugate students to professions that don't have as much social mobility, and saying instead of getting an education here, you can do this, which is more immediate, and don't allow students to gain an education which may allow them to defy certain socioeconomic class challenges and try new things. So what sort of role those trade things, although they are immediate and opportunistic, how they're supposed to play into long-term education.
I've been in Congress for over 20 years. When I was in the state Senate, I served on a committee trying to deal with career training, vocational education. And one of the things that we kept repeating over and over again is if you're going to get, if you go back 40 or 50 years, SHOP was the course you took. If you weren't going to, if you couldn't achieve academically, they stuck you over in SHOP or home ec or something like that, and you just kind of spent your time, and at the end of the 12th grade, you got a diploma. You couldn't do anything. You couldn't go to college. You know, one of the things that the more up-to-date career education is that you are using the career education as an alternative setting to get the basics. All the communication skills, reading and writing, the science, math, you learn that in a different setting. Because if you get about halfway through a vocational education track, you shouldn't be locked out of changing your mind and going to a four-year college. And I think that consensus is there. Governor Pence from Indiana testified before one of our committees, and he talked about the value of career education. I asked him specifically that question, and he made it clear that vocational education was an alternative setting to get the basics, that if you chose that course, that you do not exclude the possibility of going to a four-year liberal arts college. Now, there are a lot of things, technical things you can do. There are a lot of articulation agreements. In my hometown, the high school has a deal with the community college where you can actually take on-campus community college courses as part of your high school diploma. You've taken the courses, so when you go to community college, you may be halfway through by the time you graduate from high school. So, and if it's in a course that, there's a job waiting for you. I know a local community college has a auto mechanics course, and they say nobody ever graduates because by the time you're halfway through, all the auto shops need you, and they hire you right before you graduate. They don't even wait for you to graduate. You know so much by the time you're halfway through. So a lot of these career deals, you can get real good jobs, and you don't want to overlook that possibility. But you do not want to get yourself in a situation where you do not have the basics, because the way careers go now, you're obsolete, you got to learn something new. Lifelong learning is a reality. So you want to make sure you get the basics in high school and not get in a rut where you can't get out.
This might be the last comment.
Could be, given the time and given the way that Congressman Scott works on it. I'm Felice Levine, Executive Director of the American Educational Research Association, and I both wanted to attest to the hard-working in empirical terms. This mighty person speaking in Indianapolis, I guess, earlier today, arrived at a session that he joined spontaneously when we thought he was going to be delayed in any form of traffic, and sat down and joined a conversation about how we needed to connect research to policy to practice. So we work as an association across the aisles to kind of stimulate that kind of commitment, to make the knowledge accessible, and to work with what I would view to be a statesperson for evidence and data par excellence. So I wanted to thank you and also indicate that one of the things that we've most appreciated and valued was what you spoke to on the topic of FERPA. We all support privacy protection and ensuring protection with informed, accessible ways of using those data by states, by policy systems at the district or state levels, and by researchers in ways that reconcile and align privacy and data use with confidentiality protections. And I valued very much what you said. We have seen the working draft that together members of the Hill are aiming to come to a bipartisan way of modernizing FERPA, and we're going to do all we can to help with the expertise that we have in the education research community and within AERA to ensure that that happened. And we appreciate what you said on what is a very important topic. It may seem to be a very particularistic issue, only of interest to those who are working on issues of privacy and confidentiality and uses of administrative records in ways that can inform the very topics that you've spoken to. But without that evidence and without that data and without that commitment to high-quality statistics that institutions like the National Center for Education Statistics represent, we won't be able to advance the kind of work that you're so committed to. So I applaud what you're doing, and I want you to know that the research community and AERA is aware of that, and we're going to do all we can in this short span of time to give you the kind of input that will really help. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Congressman Scott. Did you want to say anything else? Okay. Thank you to Linda Darling-Hammond. Thank you all for coming.